Go ahead and get started, call the meeting to order. Apologies, everybody, we have no quorum, so we're going to do things out of order. We're going to do all the discussion and informational items first, public comment first, and then Kai is expected to be here at about 11. When we will have a quorum, then we can take the recommended action items. We may need to take a break if we don't, if we move through things quickly. So I'll try and go slow. So first item up, public comments, and we have David Smith wanted to address this. Just come on, wherever you want, stand, sit. We're informally here.
I hope there's enough people here that they hear my issue, but maybe you can relay it. My name's David Smith. I live in Encinitas. And my background, I'm a recently retired engineer for Los Angeles Fire Department, 32 years, so I have a pretty good idea how traffic's supposed to work. And I'm here to address the Streetscape project in Encinitas, the North 101 Streetscape project. It's a 2-mile project that converts Highway 101 from 4 lanes to 1 lane north, 1 lane south, to several roundabouts. And currently, it's often that corridor is bumper-to-bumper traffic, and it's the only north-south arterial that goes through the county. You got the 15 and the 5, and that's the only one. And this project so far has been approved, and as I read the ballot language here, it says to relieve traffic congestion. Now, there's recently an EIR came out at 1,500 pages. Flipping through that is kind of exhausting. And there's enormous problems with emergency response aspects. They're actually putting another fire engine into service to accommodate the emergency response aspects. And the traffic study says nothing about traffic congestion relief. There is absolutely nothing. It says because they're putting in bike lanes and walkways, which is all good, I would support that. There's no traffic congestion relief. It's traffic congestion causing. And I'm hoping that, I don't know how it's gotten this far. I addressed this committee, 8 years ago when it was first approved at City Council. It goes to City Council again next week. And it's very likely to be approved. It was approved by the Planning Commission last week. So I've spoken to Ariana, and I was basically told, well, it meets the goal, and I'm scratching my head seeing how does a project like this get funded by Transnet. You don't need to be a civil engineer to figure out if you're going to go from 4 lanes to 2 lanes and put a bunch of roundabouts in. That is not. The cars aren't going to go faster through there. Or more cars, and it's basically a state set in the EIR. And also your last triennial report, you outline significant issues about these programs actually not meeting their intended purpose. So
I appreciate your comments.
All right, and I don't know if you guys can say anything or not. I'm a little disappointed. I'm seeing a lot of empty chairs here. I don't know who. No,
I think we got your message. I think what we will normally do now is we don't discuss non-agenda items.
Okay.
It's non-agenda items. So ask Ariana to follow up with your request. I did see an email that you sent. And,
that was you. Okay.
And yeah. So probably next month we can put something on the agenda to discuss this or respond directly to you.
Thank you very much.
You're welcome.
Chair?
Yes.
May I make just a brief comment?
Yeah,
What our chair has told you is entirely correct. We don't make decisions on individual projects. That's up to the community. So I'm speaking as a private citizen, and I happen to agree with you. I've driven that street and to look at the roundabouts. And if they are actually planning to eliminate one of those 3 lanes, yes,
okay.
That would trouble me also. So please do pursue it with your local authorities, and I'm speaking as a private citizen.
I had a meeting with the fire chief last week, and he basically shrugged his shoulder. Well,
Thank you for your
but
service.
thank you for, yeah.
Thank you for your service with the fire department.
All right, well, thank you. And thank you for your audience.
I've got a question, which I don't know if anybody on the staff who's here has relevant knowledge of this sort of thing to comment, but my understanding is that roundabouts are usually put in as a sort of speed, traffic, safety kind of moderation issue, as opposed to having anything to do with congestion. So I don't know if anybody can speak to that here, or maybe if we take this up with some background for next month.
I have nothing against roundabouts. They slow traffic down, but they also keep traffic moving. There are no stop signs or stoplights. It's the idea of losing lanes that I get frustrated about at times. And
If they're properly sized and engineered, roundabouts are great. These aren't.
excuse me?
If they're properly sized and engineered, their roundabouts are great.
Roundabouts are fine. They have them in La Jolla, running from La Jolla to the Pacific
Yeah, my
Beach.
understanding is that the rationale for them was to sort of moderate the speeds rather than,
Well,
help the flow of traffic.
I'm not an expert on
Right.
that. But
I'm just asking the question, so maybe if we can get some more background for next meeting.
Okay. Great. I don't have any other speaker slips. Any other communications, George or Jonathan? Okay. Then we'll move to item number 3, which is, oh no, we can't do 3. No, it's on consent.
Information.
Does anybody have a reason, any questions they want to ask of Sarah? I know she's here. I reviewed this agenda item. Doesn't appear to be any changes from last time. No projects were completed and or.
if you're happy, I'm happy.
Yeah.
You're our environmental guy. So.
Yes. Sympathize with your 1,500-page EIR. All right. We don't have to do a motion or action on that. Number 4 is a summary of Transportation Committee Board of Directors with Ariana.
Since your February meeting, the Transportation Committee recommended and the board approved the Transnet fiscal year 2019 through fiscal year 2023 estimated revenues that you saw at your last meeting. The board approved the RTCIP fee adjustment. You saw that at your last meeting, and as a follow-up to a request from that last meeting, we'll be returning with an analysis of the cumulative growth against all construction cost indices to illustrate how RTCIP is keeping pace with inflation, and we will bring that back as part of an item that we plan to bring back, I believe, in May, which is a proposed cost estimating policy, so that you can see that kind of as a whole. Then on March 2nd, the Transportation Committee reviewed the same quarterly updates on the EMP Land Management Grant Program and the Smart Growth and Active Transportation Grant Programs that you saw, and then approved them. They also approved the modified scope and the 12-month extension on the City of Coronado's Seniors Out and About program, which you had a presentation on at your last meeting. Staff conveyed your comments to the Transportation Committees. They had similar questions, mainly regarding the cost per trip, and there was also a suggestion to work with FACT, which is facilitating access to coordinated transportation, to look for other options in which they might be able to enhance the service that they're providing. In addition, the Transportation Committee and the Regional Planning Committee provided comments on the 10-year look-ahead implementation plan. We have that on your agenda for you today, and we'll be sharing the comments that we heard at those as part of that item. In addition, you'll recall that AB 805 includes a requirement for an audit committee to be formed. And on March 9th, the board approved a supplemental process for the selection of public members for the SANDAG Audit Committee in order to increase the number of applicants, and applications for that are due now on April 20th. Finally, the executive director job opening closed earlier this week, and my understanding is that we've received more than 20 applications. And so that now moves to the selection phase, and interviews for that position are anticipated to occur at the April 27th board to occur.
So the audit committee, that was extended because there was not adequate response.
I don't think the number of applications that we would have anticipated would receive. So they're doing more outreach and getting the word out in different ways.
On the executive director search, you mentioned 20 applicants. Is that inclusive of both people who just may have submitted over the transom, so to speak, as well as the ones that people identified in the search process by the search consultant?
So this is applications received. So
Would it be
whichever
inclusive of, regardless of
Yes.
source, right? Got it.
Do they have any goal for when the decision will be made?
Right, so as Ariana mentioned, the selection process will occur over the next couple of weeks, and then the board is scheduled to hold interviews at its April 27th meeting. And so pending that and board decision, then hopefully someone early summer.
It could be summer, then, good.
Now, unfortunately, I think we skipped to item 8. This is the fiscal year 2019 Transit Early Action Program budget update.
Thank you. So I'm Susan Huntington. I'm the Transnet Project Office Manager, and I'm going to present today the draft budget for next year, the FY19 draft budget. So the Board of Directors will be asked to review the draft budget on March the 23rd. And then again, the final budget will be presented on the 4th Friday in May. During the annual update, project budgets are right-sized. We work with the project managers and the project teams to update cost, scope, and schedule of the projects within the early action program. A summary table noting the changes between the current approved budgets and the proposed draft budgets is included as attachment 1 of your report. And then within the report itself, there's a blurb for each project that has an overall budget change, kind of explaining what the budget change is about. So I just wanted to highlight some of the major changes that you'll see in attachment 1. So the draft budget proposes to add $23 million for the construction phase of the I-5 Voight Drive Improvements Project. And you may recall that the I-5 team was here in January to talk about that project. The project includes realignment of the Voight Drive to accommodate the Midcoast project, as well as local street improvements. The project team anticipates advertising this project in August and beginning construction in early 2019. And the funds to pay for the construction phase are coming both from Transnet and from UCSD. Another change you'll note in the attachment that's rather significant is the Bataquitas Lagoon double track. For the draft budget, we have reduced the funding by $31.5 million. That's Transnet funds that we pulled off of that project. Those Transnet funds were a placeholder for the construction phase. And what we've done with the draft budget is we pulled the Transnet dollars off. We thought that this project would be competitive for some of the SB1 programs, excuse me. And so the project is about 90% designed. The final costs are still being refined. And so we submitted applications for 2 of the SB1 programs. The CTC has allocated over $10 million of the local partnership program funds to this project for final design and construction, and those dollars will be added on into the final budget. So that that'll be added on for the final, as well as the corresponding 50% match for Transnet that will be added on there. So we've added back on, so we took off 31, we've added back on 20 for the final. And then we're also waiting for a CTC decision on our SB1 TIRCP application, and that will come in May. So hopefully we'll be back in June with some good news that we've added on more state funds, and Transnet will be the match for those state funds. And then you'll notice within the goods movement corridor, we continue to move forward with the implementation of the SR11 and the new port of entry. Along with the draft budget, on March 23rd, the board will be asked to accept federal fast lane grant funds and other corridor infrastructure funds for the next phase of construction on this project. So that this draft budget reflects that action, as well as splits the project into 3 separate CIPs. So as the projects go into construction, we're splitting off into a different CIP for each.
So far we've completed the construction on the new SR11 from the 125 to Enrique Ferme. And then in FY19, construction is scheduled to begin on the portion from Enrico Ferme to the Port of Entry. And we continue to move forward with the Regional Bikeway Program. We've added new state active transportation funds to the Inland Rail Trail for the construction of 2 miles in the city of Vista. And 5 additional projects in the bike program will go into construction in FY19, including Uptown Bikeways 4th and 5th Avenue, San Diego River Trail Stadium segment, Bayshore Bikeway Barrio Logan, and 2 projects within North Park Mid-City Bikeway, the Landis Bikeway and the Georgia Mead Bikeway. So with that, I will answer your
Could you just tell me if I'm interpreting this correctly? So if I go to page 7, the summary of the spreadsheet,
Yes.
it looks as if the aggregate change of the 47.9 million is, if I'm doing this or thinking about this correctly, it looks like that's completely a shifting from the fiscal 2018 budget into the 2019 budget. Is that, am I missing something if I characterize it that way?
So these budgets are the total cost of the project. It's not on an annual basis. So we do this update annually, but this isn't a fiscal year. This 47 or 48 million reflects the additional new funds being added into the program.
Oh, okay, got it. Okay. It just looked as if perhaps what was happening is we're shifting, but I understand what you're saying. This is an aggregate number, right?
Correct.
Okay.
So within the draft budget itself, I don't know if you all have seen the budget, it's about this big. Within Chapter 9 is the capital budget, and within the capital budget, there are single sheets for each one of these projects, which lays out the phases and the years in which we're going to be planning to spend. So if you wanted to look at it at that level of detail, that is provided in Chapter 9 of the budget.
Good, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Susan. Okay, so on to item number 9. This is the proposed look ahead. Ariana's something.
No idea. Okay, we have a little,
Pick up.
we need Michael to step out to get a copy, so.
Okay.
We actually have PowerPoints for the next two items, so. Okay. Probably a good idea before I start pushing buttons.
There you go.
That doesn't mean much. Which one is it? Yes. It's me. We'll give it an effort. Our new job. You can do it. Let's see if this is gonna work. Oh yay! We did it, see? Okay. I need a bonus. Just saying. So last time you saw the 10-year review was in January, when we and your auditors also were here to present that. And so that was the look back report, and you provided feedback, and we also presented the same look back report to the Transportation Committee, Regional Planning Committee, the EMP Working Group, and then the board at the end of January. But now we're here to kick off the second step in the process, which is the look ahead. And so that's what we're going to be talking about today. So this is the section 17 out of the ordinance, which talks about the comprehensive review of all projects and programs in the ordinance, to evaluate performance over previous 10 years and make revisions to improve performance over subsequent 10 years. The requirement for the 10-year review was put into the ordinance as a comprehensive check-in to periodically take the time to see how the program is doing as a whole and to consider any changes. And to accomplish this requirement, the board chose to align the timing of the review with the ITOC performance audit and with the 2019 regional plan activities that are currently underway. That was in order to take advantage of the opportunity to streamline activities across these efforts with an eye toward having the 10-year review inform the 2019 regional plan. So to that end, the board elected to conduct the review as a two-step process, as you know. The first step, the board elected to conduct a look back to assess the performance of the overall program to date, and that was conducted by the ITOC performance auditors and concluded with the board's review at its January 26 meeting. And now that the first step has been completed, we still need to accomplish the second step, and that's where we would use the results of the look back as a basis for you and the board and the other policy advisory committees to consider any changes that may be necessary. And then where appropriate, we would also consider any potential revisions to either the ordinance or to the board policies to improve performance for the Transnet program going forward. So with that in mind, we prepared a proposed implementation approach. This was presented to the Transportation Committee and Regional Planning Committee earlier this month, and we received some comments that we're going to be sharing with you as well. And those are summarized on page 2 of your report. Attachment 1 of your report includes a proposed matrix that would be used to track implementation progress. It lists future considerations that were included in the 10-year look-back report, as well as feedback that was received from, as I mentioned, the ITOC, Regional Planning Committee, Transportation Committee, EMP Working Group, and the board during that look-back review. We've highlighted preliminary action items and laid out a proposed high-level implementation schedule for each of those. That's the blue coloring on the matrix, which identifies the time frame that's estimated for each item's implementation. And then action items are not listed in any priority order, but since presenting about a week ago to the Transportation Committee and the Regional Planning Committee, we've incorporated some additional detail to indicate where some action items are already underway through other efforts that the agency already is moving forward on as part of its regular course of business and part of its existing program budget. And Michael went to get you a color copy of that attachment. I apologize, so that you can see the blue and the areas that are currently covered under the existing program budget. I know we've made a note there as well, but then for you'll see some orange in the color copy that you'll receive in a minute. There we've indicated where we still need to provide the board with what the cost, time, and resources to implement some of the more resource and effort intensive, right, exactly, the heavier lift items. So we've grouped actions under 3 separate categories, and those are shown in green. Group A includes general items that are proposed to be brought back individually with further analysis and options for consideration. For example, items A6 on the matrix, that proposes to revisit the local street and road congestion relief and maintenance definitions. These provide guidance to local agencies on eligible types of street and road projects, and you may recall that the 10-year review suggested modifying the board policy definitions under each category to more closely align with today's regional needs. Another example under Group A would be A11, maximizing the effective use of the local project EMP fund, which provides mitigation funding for local jurisdictions. The 10-year review look back suggested that repurposing these funds within ordinance limitations could potentially be considered. And then we list group items or items in Group B. Those would be addressed under future State of the Commute reports. State of the Commute reports provide level of service and travel time comparisons and are presented on an annual basis, usually in the springtime. Under the Group B, we've listed a couple action items, including performing a deeper analysis of transit and vehicular commute times based on the feedback that we received as part of the look back. And then finally, we've got several items under Group C, and those would be addressed under regional plan activities, either as part of the performance measures or as part of the white papers that are being discussed, or with the transportation network development process that is currently underway, or under the performance monitoring efforts, all scheduled to be completed later this calendar year under regional plan activities. In addition, we're proposing to provide the board, the Transportation Committee, the ITOC, and the Regional Planning Committee with ongoing updates on the overall implementation on a regular basis. So on the status, kind of like what we do with the performance audit for the ITOC every 6 months or so. We're also proposing to conduct a peer review process where some of the more data-intensive considerations from the 10-year review, such as region-wide performance tracking, can undergo review consistent with the SANDAG Chair's Plan of Excellence. And so today we're looking for preliminary ideas on this proposed approach, and if there's other areas that we haven't captured, that you would like to, let us know about, then we can certainly consider those as we work toward developing a roadmap as we move forward with implementation. So as we mentioned earlier, feedback from discussion at Transportation Committee and Regional Planning Committees on March 2nd is noted in the report, but to call out just a couple of the discussion points, these 2 action items that we listed here on the screen were included in the future considerations of the look back report. For example, A5 on page 4, it proposes to consider region-wide allocations from Transnet or other sources for performance tracking and reporting. This action would require extensive coordination with stakeholders to discuss what the best approach to addressing this area might be. And at the Transportation Committee and the Regional Planning Committees, generally there was support for this item, although there were some questions as to how goals might be measured across local jurisdictions, given that each has different needs. Another consideration from the look back to be explored includes C4. On page 11 of your report, this one contemplates reevaluating the portfolio of projects remaining to be completed to ensure they're the best mix compared to goals of the ordinance. And some of the feedback we received on this one included that when reevaluating the mix of projects remaining to be completed, that staff take a coordinated approach such that projects proposed to be added or removed be considered as part of the overall regional plan transportation scenario network development process. We also heard that continuing funding for what has already been committed to is important. For example, where Transnet has funded new transit capital improvements and also would fund operations for those same services, for example, the Superloop, Rapid, and Midcoast. We also heard changes to the mix should be considered within modes, such that new proposed highway projects would be evaluated against remaining highway projects, and same for transit. Before we wrap it up, we'd just like to take a minute to let you know some of the progress that we've been able to accomplish so far. Today marks the kickoff date, and we've incorporated final comments into the look back report. We've launched a 10-year review webpage where information on the look back is currently stored, and we'll also be providing continuous updates for the look ahead implementation on that webpage. Staff is working on summarizing the look back report as an infographic, so that's a shortened, maybe 3-4 page summary of the entire report so that that can be more widely distributed within the next month or so. And staff has presented to the ITAC the projection comparing major corridors debt service to capacity for new projects. This was a request from the ITAC as part of its feedback on the look back. We did that at the last ITAC meeting. In addition, later this fiscal year, we anticipate wrapping up action items such as looking into fare levels and transit ridership under the transit fare study that is currently underway. There was a request to consider VMT reduction under adoption of the regional plan performance measures. That's also currently underway and expected to be completed this fiscal year. So there's a total of 20 items listed on the implementation plan matrix, and there's 6 that we would anticipate completed by the end of June. Next steps. We're proposing to make refinements based on the input that we received today, and then we would probably go back to the board of directors sometime either in May or June. And then in terms of the ongoing check-in on the overall implementation status, the first of those status updates would be this fall. That's it.
Comments? Questions? Questions?
I have a couple of questions, please. I don't know if they're appropriate or not. First, on a specific item, A6, elimination of the 70-30 congestion relief and maintenance ratio, modify the split, and also define the 1-inch requirement. What's the progress being made on that? I've always sort of scratched my head. And this would end, you're saying that this item is being accomplished, but it's going to take an ordinance amendment and an amendment to board policy, which can be significant. Can you give us a quick update? Is this going to happen someday, or?
Yeah, so it may require an ordinance update.
Okay.
It's probably more likely that it would be a board policy amendment.
But you expect it to happen?
So similar to when we worked on the recommendations from one of your prior audits on the
Yes,
local
that
street
came-
view
that was a
recommendations.
recommendation that
We're gonna
I
need
got
to
involved in.
make the rounds and visit, sit down with CTAC members and get their input on changes that may need to be made to the board policy to update that. So I think we anticipate that that might happen in the next 2-3 months.
Okay, do you think that we may see some, I'm curious, do you think we may see some action on that?
Yeah, and
Okay.
we would need to come back to this committee
You'll
as
come
well
back
to
and
kind
tell
of
us
get
about
that
it. Good.
input and share the feedback that we
Okay.
receive.
I think in terms of timing, there's a number of things that pending, let's see, items that may be brought, changes to the transit ordinance, right? So the 10-year review has raised some things. The 70/30's been around for a while.
Yes, I
We
know
haven't
it.
really opened, the board hasn't chosen to open the ordinance and made all these changes. I think because it's a 10-year review, it's an opportunity to do that. So we know this is sort of on the table. There are a number of things that the transit operators are discussing. We're in the process of doing a comprehensive fare study update.
All right.
And so they are signaling some changes that they may want to some of the policies that may also impact the ordinance. So I think staff's thought was, hey, we're keeping track of all these things. These are all going to be brought up. It'd be nice actually when we bring it, that we just do sort of one, to the extent we can, one comprehensive change to the ordinance to
I
address
got
some
you.
of these.
And you are consulting with CTAC, are you
Yes.
not?
Absolutely.
On 70/30 to
Yes.
see?
Yes.
Good, thank you.
I think a lot of some of the discussions coming out of the 10-year review and other performance audit, and from like the operators in the cities, are flexibility in being able to use the funding. So I think, the 70/30, removing that 70/30 requirement obviously would provide them more flexibility. They could use it for maintenance type projects or, more than congestion relief if that were their needs. So.
But was that part of the original bond measure, or was that a local policy?
It's part of the ordinance, and I think the rationale behind that was really, the ordinance really, if you look at some of the ballot language, talks about congestion relief.
Right.
And so the focus really was on.
No, I understand. They didn't want cities to take all this money and put it on maintenance,
Right.
leaving their budgets.
Right.
But to make an ordinance change, does this have to go back to the voters, or
Not this
No,
section.
not this
Some
one.
sections do, this section would not.
it could be
Yeah.
changed, modified
By
locally?
2/3
By
vote of
2/3.
the board of directors.
Of the board.
Yeah.
Okay, thank
There
you.
are, I want to say, half a dozen sections that would require, if to make a change, would require taking it back to the voters. And so those
Okay.
are generally.
Well, thank you. Please, I find that interesting issue, and please keep us advised. And the second question,
Go ahead.
I wish Dick Fortman were here.
He's
He's
here.
afraid that we're going to keep becoming more and more indebted through bond measures, that our grandchildren will be doing nothing more than paying off the previous bonds. My question is on your look-ahead process. Does it include an analysis? I see we have another bond, a smaller bond measure is item number 11, I think it is, or 10, item number 10 today. Does the look-ahead process include any analysis of future bond measures?
A10 refers to considering the impact of potential changes to sales taxes over time. So I would think that would capture that as well. So yes.
And I think, every time that we do a plan of finance, obviously one of the things that the plan of finance considers is there capacity or need to do additional bond issuances. And so, as part of the Daily Action Program over the past 10 years, there's been a number of bond issuances to support the implementation of that Early Action Program. But as we transition over to a pay-as-you-go approach, the number of bond issuances that we anticipate, at least at this point in time, is over the next 2-3 years, we're going to be done with bond issuances. Things may change, later in time, but at least what we see on the horizon right now is that the number of bond issuances you know, we'll do a few more over the next 2-3 years, and then we'll just transition over to a pay-as-you-go and stop doing bond issuances.
Interesting, okay. I have no objections to.
Right, but it's one of the things that,
reaction
as we do plan,
projects.
you know, as we do the plan of finance, because it's an annual process, we look at all of our assumptions, you know, revenues, costs, timing, et cetera, just to be able to freshen them up and be able to bring options to the board in terms of, these are your challenges, your opportunities, how would you like to proceed?
Okay, I guess I understand what you're saying. Thank you, Jose.
I've got 3 questions, or you had something
No, go
else
ahead,
that
go
you
ahead.
related to what initial Jonathan?
I can.
So, 3 questions I've got are, first, does this represent the entire universe of recommendations that would have come out of the look back and other, or is this a sort of a subset of ones that staff in conjunction with board or subcommittees are deciding to pursue?
It's based on the feedback that we heard at the committees. It's
Okay.
based on the letter that the ITAC provided to the board as well. So all of that is included in here. It's one column, so we kind of grouped similar
Sure.
items. So we may have heard it, you know, more than once, and then kind of grouped it or a little bit differently. For example, the 70/30, it says eliminate, and it also says modify, and it also says revisit. So kind of, yes, but it is supposed to capture everything. So if we've missed something, we definitely want to know if we didn't hear something, and we should have.
Great, thanks. The second thing that I was going to just point out with regard to the go forward is we're kind of coming to the final stages of the triennial performance report, and I think that there are probably a few recommendations that are coming out of that report that may be worth considering as part of some of this go forward recommendation that I would just suggest that it looks like, based on the timeline, there will be opportunity to potentially consider and incorporate some of those recommendations as well as that.
Yes, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay.
And here under the third column, proposed action item, you know, where we kind of anticipate that triennial to potentially have some recommendations that are related. We've tried to note that here so that we can take the performance audit conclusions into as we move forward with implementation.
And then the last thing is just the reference to the periodic updating on the implementation. It just comes to mind, it's a bit of a digression, but is there a similar periodic updating on the implementation of the 7-point plan that was created, brought up, what was it? It's about a year ago now that was.
That's part of the plan of excellence, right?
It is.
Can you rephrase the question, Stuart, so that I can answer?
Yeah, the question is
exactly
simply that with regard to the, reference to periodic updating on implementation of the recommendations coming out of the 10-year look back and the go forward, if there's a similar periodic updating that's being provided on the implementation of the 7-point plan, because I haven't heard much about it lately, and there were a whole lot of important and and good things in there that hopefully you're moving forward on. And I'm not necessarily asking for an update right now. I'm just curious if there is a quarterly or a periodic update on that.
So we took the 7-point plan to, after I think we explained it over here, we took it to the board, and they in turn came back with something called the Plan of Excellence. And the Plan of Excellence includes all of the forward-looking things that were in the 7-point plan, so things like the quality assurance, things like expert review panels, those type of things were rolled into what is a more global Plan of Excellence. And so those are now monitored by the board of directors. Is it a quarterly update that we're going to be doing for it?
Yeah, we haven't brought it back, so when it was last year when the board looked at kind of the Plan of Excellence, it looks at recommendations coming out of the 7-point plan, recommendations that came out of the Houston-Hennigan independent investigation. The Taxpayers Association also had made a number of recommendations in terms of better communication. So it includes kind of there's 8 sort of different categories. So we're planning on bringing an update to the board on the full plan of excellence in, I want to say, the May or June timeframe. So we're happy to bring it here as well when we get that ready. It really looked at, besides the data issues, how we communicate better with our board policies in terms of our records management policies, training of staff on records management. So it was sort of the gamut from, like, I'd say the three things: 7-point plan and all these external.
And I think there were a few new hires that were part of the
Yeah,
plan as
that
well, so-
goes with it. It was,
Yeah.
And so that was included in the, in
Yeah.
our
So we
request for
can,
budget
we can
too.
bring, when we're doing kind of the internal tracking of it right now, and so we, like I said, we are planning, we're collecting it all in one place, and so we're planning on bringing it back in May and June, so we can have to bring that here as well.
Yeah, because I'm sure it's not lost on any of you how much controversy and attention there was surrounding everything that gave rise to the impetus to do that. And, you know, I think I would just suggest that good governance would suggest that, as opposed to just saying, hey, we're going to do a whole bunch of stuff and maybe it happens, maybe it doesn't. It would be really helpful to have some update on that.
And I know you heard-
It's about a year since that was initially proposed.
And Susan talked about kind of the capital program, but the broader fiscal year draft fiscal year 2019 program budget does implement a significant part of the plan of excellence and the 7-point plan in terms of we're adding 2 positions, or actually 4 positions sort of dedicated to that, 2 regular and 2 limited term, basically a QA/QC function, a program management function, and some of the key, I said, skill sets that we needed to shore up our data and research and data management work. So we'll bring that to you guys.
Great, thank you.
I only had a couple things. So I like all of these proposed action items. And then to Stuart's point, yes, the Triennial will have some stuff that I think should be included in here. Will this be, the end product would be a recommendation or set of recommendations to the board? And then those things that required a specific ordinance change and or would get pulled out so that in one package to do it all at once? So would all of these things still remain tracked together, even though we're kind of separating things out?
They would, that's the idea, that they would be, as part of this matrix, tracked together. They would go for approval for the board, May, June timeframe. Some of them we're already working on,
Yeah, so
because
the
we
ones
already
that
are
would-
working on the regional plan. We already are, right, so some of those items are already underway.
The ones
And
like
so
you
they'll
said.
see them as part of the regional plan, and then the ones that are standalone, they'll just come as they're ready as separate items, but the overall reporting would be done through this matrix.
So the ones that you identify as potentially being done fiscal year 2018 wouldn't fall off, they would just show these?
No, they wouldn't fall off.
Okay,
Yeah,
I
the
just
idea is
want
to house it
one
all in one
complete
place. Yeah, that's a
package.
good, yeah.
Yeah.
What is the policy or what is the rules for some of these heavy lifts that may require additional staffing or funding? How is it determined when it's too much or when it's, the effort to do this would be far exceed the benefit? How is that decided and when is that decided?
So one of the things that, one of the feedback that we got at Transportation Committee especially was, we brought to them, a number of these, follow-up actions, and their question was, well, how much is it going to cost? And what essentially is going to be the extent or the scope of work of these efforts. So that's one of the kind of the follow-ups that we need to do, is try to, bring options in terms of the size of the effort and how much it would cost, to give them a better perspective of, okay, this is, if you want to do this, this is how much it's going to cost, so that they can give us direction on that.
So they'll be the ultimate decider.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think some of it, if you look at, came out of the 10-year review, has come out of, you've discussed many of your triennial performance audits are, let's say, reporting from local governments on how they use their local street and road funding. So obviously you do your audits, you check whether they're spent on eligible costs, and so from those sort of financial and compliance rules, all 18 cities in the county are complying, right? You have an item on your agenda today. But I think what the outside auditors are saying is, hey, we should report on metrics like pavement condition index, whatever, outcome metrics, not just, output metrics. And so that, I think, will require more reporting resources from the cities, from, in our early discussions with them. Some of them, they do it, some of them are small, and they have one staff member that does a whole bunch of things. And so that's where I think they want to know, well, how much is this going to cost the agency, Sandag, to actually stand up a program to track that? Obviously, if it's a few things, it's probably more manageable. If it's 10, 20, it's a lot of data gathering. It's obviously be more costly, more resource intensive. So it's things like that that I think the committee board members wanted to understand. Like, how much is this actually going to cost? Can we design something that can do it but be sort of cost efficient? Yeah.
Thank you.
I didn't have any other questions.
Thanks.
Thank you, Ariana. And this color copy makes it much
I know,
clearer.
sorry.
No, it's fine. So that was number 9, I believe. So number 10 is the Andre Jose, the proposed 2018 short-term bond issuance.
Thank you. So if you recall, the last quarterly financial market update report that Ray and I gave you last month, we mentioned that we're about to issue some short-term bonds. So I just wanted to kind of give you an overview today as to where we are in the process and when we intend to actually go to the markets. So as is always the case when we go to issue bonds, it's not just the Sandag team that's been working on this effort. We usually have a group of outside professionals, our PFM financial advisors working on this, along with Auric, who's our bond counsel, and Fulbright, who's our disclosure counsel. And then our lead underwriter this time is Citibank with Wells Fargo and Bank of America as co-managers. So there's 5 things I just want to go over today briefly. First was, why do we need to issue these short-term notes? Secondly, the size, structure, and projected debt service looking forward. And then just some credit considerations. And then the various bond documents that are out there available for review. And then lastly, just a calendar on when we, how we proceed. So one of the things that we've presented here before is the Transit Plan of Finance, which basically we also take to the board that updates all our projections for Transnet along with other state and federal resources, as well as our expenditures and the timeline for it. And this chart shows that from 2012 to 2017, we've spent almost $500 million on the Mid-Coast project. And then going forward, you can see our expenditures ramp up quite a bit in 2018. This year we expect to spend $300 million, and then in 2019 and 20 is going to be the height of it, approximately $400 million per year. So basically the reason why we're needing to issue these short-term notes is based on our projected expenditures here over the next 3 years, which are already ramping up. So currently,
Excuse me, Andre, if I could.
Yeah.
So maybe I'm not remembering correctly, but I was under the impression that there was an anticipated short-term financing, which would basically get taken out by the TIFIA loan. Is that what this is?
Perfect. This is in fact, this is the slide that shows that.
Okay. Okay. I would just, well, suggest, I think if Dick were here, you'd probably want to have that in big bold-faced letters, so it's not in the sense an incremental financing. It's one that was already contemplated, and in fact is kind of a bridge to the TIFIA loan. Is really the purpose for doing this, right?
Maybe I should come to the slide first.
Yeah,
but this
sure.
is what this.
Okay.
I didn't understand that either.
Right.
Thank you.
Yeah, it kind of looks like this is a new financing.
It does.
And that was, I think, would have thrown some of us off. But anyway, that makes it perfectly understandable.
Okay.
Thanks for the clarity.
Yeah, so basically what this chart shows is the blue lines is our level debt service going out to 2048, which is approximately $105 million annually. The little yellow is our commercial paper, although it's a short-term program. We've just said if we amortize that all the way through to 2048. So the little green bars are what the interest costs are, which is approximately $21 million per year on these short-term notes. And then in 5 years, we actually In 2021, we take it out with the TIFIA loan that we currently have locked at 2.72%, and then we start payment in 2026. I mean, one of the nice things about the TIFIA loan, if you recall, besides the lower rate, was the flexibility. The flexibility for us is during these kind of heavy years of construction, a lot of building going on, that we could actually start paying on these notes a little further. So you're absolutely right. All this is, it's a mechanism for us to borrow on the shorter yield curve and then take it out with the longer. So right now these notes are costing us approximately 1.92% based on this week's rates. It change obviously once we go to market. So it's basically borrowing at 1.92%, paying a lower yield, and then ultimately taking it out with a 2.72%, which in itself is a very low yield. For example, the 30-year Treasury, which is what it's tied to, is in the 3.15 range today, but we're not borrowing at that because we locked it back in June when the rate was 2.72%. Another great thing about the TIFIA loan, that you could actually lock it at the date. So rates could be 4% when we end up taking it out. Doesn't matter. We're going to be borrowing at 2.72%. One of the things too is this is going to be sitting in our junior lien, on our subordinate lien. So our AAA ratings right now for our main program, which is the $1.7 billion that we have outstanding, this is going to be sitting below that, junior to that. So we actually don't have a rating on that lien. Currently our commercial paper is on that lien. Our commercial paper is, however, has short-term ratings, the highest short-term ratings, but we needed to go out and get longer-term ratings on this short-term note. So we met with rating agencies a couple weeks ago in San Francisco, the whole team, and we expect to get ratings on them next week. The one thing I want to point out though is currently we only need 2 ratings, so we're going to be getting them from S&P and Fitch. We're not going to get any ratings from Moody's. And also these ratings should have no impact on our senior lien coverage. On our senior lien debt, we expect those to remain at AAA. The bond documents, we're not going to review the bond documents here, but if you're interested, they're actually going to our Transportation Committee this week, and then the following week they'll go to the board. The documents that will be going to them is first the official statement. That's the equivalent of when a public stock company goes IPO, there's a prospectus. That's a similar thing. It's a document that it basically gives investors an opportunity to understand what the agency is all about, our outstanding debt, our future projects, etc. So it's kind of the full document for investors to make their investment decision whether they want to buy the bonds. Then the subordinate indenture basically sets forth the terms of the bonds and the duties of the commission and the trustee. The first supplemental agreement is actually the terms of the particular series of bonds that we're issuing. The note purchase agreement is an agreement between us and the underwriters, in this case Citibank, and the other 2 co-managers as to when we release the bonds, they agreed to purchase them. And then the continuing disclosure agreement is basically Sandag has obligations to let the investors know of any significant things that go on over the next 3 years in particular for these bonds. So lastly, the next steps, like I just mentioned, over the next 2 weeks we'll be going to the Transportation Committee and the board with a full set of documents. Our legal team will be there to present each of these documents in detail to the board. Then as soon as the board, once they approve it on the 23rd, we'll be posting the preliminary official statements for investors to review it, and then right away we'll start the marketing of the bonds. And then the week of April 2nd, we hope to price the bonds, and then 2 weeks later from that we'll close, we'll actually get the funds at that point. So that's all I have to present, and I'll take the question.
I just have a technical question because this isn't my business. So the senior and the subordinate liens that we have out, would this be considered?
So this would be the subordinate lien.
This would be the subordinate.
Underneath the senior.
Underneath the senior, and that's interesting. Do we have any other subordinate liens out now? Are these all these,
Yeah. So currently we have the commercial paper
the
program.
commercial paper, that is subordinate to the long-term
Correct.
liens that we have, the senior liens?
Right, and that, we have capacity of 100 million on the commercial paper. Currently, there's like 26 million outstanding.
All right. Okay. Thank you.
You may have answered this before, but if you could just refresh your memory, is there any political risk with regard to the actual funding of the TIFIA loan? How are those funds actually protected against, several years down the road? There's no federal budget passed, or, Congress goes crazy and the government is operating under, severe austerity or something of that nature.
I guess maybe I'll ask Kim or Jose to answer that question, but the way that we've done our bond documents for this particular issuance is if we issue these notes and something happens where we, for some reason, cannot draw down on the TIFIA loan, we would take these out with sales tax bonds. We'd have other source of financing to go long term. And so that's kind of important for the rating agencies and investors to know, just the question you answered. If something happens and you can't, for some reason, draw on your TIFIA loan, we're covered to the fact that we have the capacity to draw on sales tax to pay those. But as far as the risks,
My understanding with the TIFIA loans, when we signed that document, that after that was executed, the TIFIA loan agreement, they actually took that money from Treasury and it's sitting for us.
Sitting there.
It's sitting, so
Yeah,
it's
it's been
not
set
subject
aside.
to future appropriations or lack thereof.
Got it. Okay. Great. Thank you.
Okay. Could I make one more observation? Our debt coverage ratio for the combined senior and subordinate liens will drop to 2.13. Right now, we're about 2.6.
2.7.
And you say that this is still strong coverage. I'm glad to hear that. Will this change in the future when we take out with TIFIA loans, or what will happen at that time, and how strong is this? At what point do you feel that we're no longer in a strong position?
Yes, so currently our AAA notes are at a 2.7 times coverage, our senior lien. And as you mentioned, now that we're putting this additional debt, that coverage stays the same. And what comes next is the junior lien, and that's at 2.13, like you mentioned. And then the TIFIA loan will actually sit below that when that is taken out. So our goal is to try and maintain the AAA rates for our current bondholders, and we're fairly comfortable that based on this financing, that's not going to change, and it won't change when we take out the TIFIA loan. Now, Jose mentioned in the future maybe one or two bond issuances are left over the next 2 or 3 years. When we issue additional bonds, at that point we may drop from a AAA to a AA. Depends on our debt service coverage at the time, depends on our sales tax, the amount of sales tax that is coming in. But for this particular transaction, based on where it's sitting on the lien, there should be no impact at all to our AAA ratings.
That's right. It is dependent upon the revenue, isn't it? Right. Interesting. All right.
And just lastly, I would say also, maybe the documents for the March 16th Transportation Committee meeting are already posted, but perhaps for the March 23rd, again, you might want to just put sort of like a big headline, making clear for people that this is really in anticipation of the TIFIA loan, because I think that'll make the dialogue, or it'll just make it that much more understandable for people up front.
Yeah, I appreciate the feedback. I'll start both presentations.
Yeah.
Thank you. Here we are, 10:30. Kai is expected to be here about 11.
You want to adjourn for a little bit and reopen?
Yeah, I think that's what we should do.
Should we what?
We're going to adjourn for a little bit and come back once Kai has
Which
arrived.
items are still remaining? Well,
We
I
got,
can figure it out.
Any of the action items?
yes, 1, 5, 5A, 5B, 6, and 7.
1, 5A, 5B, F,
6 and 7.
And then 6 and 7, appointed and approved.
Do you want to reconvene at
Okay.
11?
Yes, so let's reconvene at 11.
And I said, no.
Adjourn.
Okay.
We are now reconvened. We have Ty. Thank you, Ty. We expect some great things from you. So we'll go ahead and do approval of last month's meeting minutes. Does anybody have any comments or edits?
Second.
Okay, all those in favor? And then we're going to move to 6 first. That is the annual report, proposed schedule and appointment of subcommittee. And Ariana's going to lead that discussion.
Okay. So, as you know, one of the responsibilities of the ITAC is to prepare an annual report to the standard board and the public on the results of the annual fiscal audits. And also, the ITAC provides the results of its triennial performance audit as part of its annual report. Last year, the ITAC elected to form a subcommittee to work with staff in drafting its annual report. And this year, the process, or a similar process, is also being proposed. Attachment 1 to your report includes an estimated schedule for your review for this year's preparation of the annual report. It's anticipated that the subcommittee could potentially meet the week of March 19th if necessary to provide initial ideas on the report format and content. And then again, after each ITAC meeting, meet as necessary, leading up to approval of the draft and the final annual report that would be presented to the full ITAC at the June and July meetings, as well as to the board on July 27th. We also included attachment 2 to your report. That's last year's annual report, so that today you may also provide us with any preliminary feedback on what the report content and report format for this year might need to look like. And the action for you today is to appoint no more than 3 voting members to serve on the annual report subcommittee, including the project manager to develop the 2018 ITAC annual report.
Yeah. Brad, Caitlin, and Ted are the obvious choices.
That's who you appoint? Okay.
Can I just ask for an informational question? Because all the calendars of different projects and whatnot escape me. It's my understanding that this annual report will be the principal vehicle through which we communicate the results of the triennial performance report. So does this schedule match up with when that report is going to be finalized in a way that flows?
Yes, absolutely. So, so we've included here the dates when both the fiscal audit, the draft fiscal audit would be accepted, which is today, and then the performance audit, the draft performance audit, you would be considering that at your April meeting, April 11th meeting. So we wrote,
got it.
ITAR considers the
Sorry,
draft.
it was there.
Yeah, we
Okay,
need the
thanks.
results of both of those before we can put the annual report together. So, but to some extent, we can get to work on it, a little sooner on some of the other areas and just leave some placeholders for those. That's one way of doing it. Another way is to hold off until the April 11th. We could do that as well. We might just need to revisit some of the dates, and the turnarounds internally with our creative services staff and with our communications folks and such. But this is an estimated schedule.
I personally like the format that we developed last year.
The actual
Suggested changes to that format. Do we have any that are present that wish to be a part of this committee?
I'll be happy to do what I always have comments. But I do want to make sure that, because I think there's a lot of good stuff in the triennial performance audit, so I want to make sure we do a good job of presenting those and featuring those. So,
And Dustin, you'll be making the report.
Yeah, I was gonna.
Send that.
I am. I don't wish to chair it or whatever the term you use, project manager, but being on the triennial and
Like a volunteer.
I think,
Well-
I think,
It might be good for something.
yeah, that's what I was thinking.
Yeah.
If you guys, I don't know if Caitlin, she is.
Yeah, we
this-
could ask them. Dick also had a lot of good contributions last year, so
Do we?
maybe somebody could feel out their interests.
We can appoint maybe two, and then we'll follow up with Caitlin and Dick to see if.
Okay.
Okay.
Sounds good.
Yeah, I'm interested, but not, I have too many conflicts in the first month when I'm getting going to be parts of a, I would not be able to participate fully, so I think it's better, you know, like Caleb would be great if she's
Okay.
Okay,
Do we need do we need a motion?
we do.
So
Appoint
that,
a subcommittee.
I'd make a motion that the appointed subcommittee would be Stuart, myself, and either Caitlin or Dick, depending on whether they can or cannot commit.
I second.
All those in favor? Okay. Excellent.
So amongst the three, they could pick a chair or everything and that.
Yeah, yeah,
We don't need to do that.
we don't do it right now, do we? May I amend my motion?
Including a project manager.
Can I amend my motion to nominate Stuart as the project manager?
Okay.
I'm happy to do that.
Okay,
You chair
great.
the audit with Frank.
I second the amendment.
Okay.
For that, yes, okay.
Do we need a revote, or
We need another vote?
Yeah.
we all vote yes?
Yes.
And so just for clarity with regard to Brown Act compliance, if anybody who's not on the committee has comments on this draft or any other suggestions along in the process, they can save them for these meetings or send them to you individually, but we can't circulate them amongst ourselves because that would create
That's right,
an
you
issue.
can, yeah, you can send to me. We're gonna come back at least 2 times, so in July, that's another opportunity.
Got that, Jonathan?
Yeah, that makes sense.
We still invite your comments. It's just that to make any comments you have on this draft or in the process, that for Brown Act requirements, you have to save them either for an open meeting or to send them to Ariana.
Okay, all right, thank you. Do we have it? We don't have the draft.
No, there is a
Oh, no.
draft there.
Well, it's last
Well,
year.
that's,
That's
well,
last
that's last
year's.
year's in terms of formatting.
Thank you, fine.
Yeah.
All right, oh, I like that. That's fine.
Okay. Do we want to take anything else out of order? Yes, folks here.
Okay, I think we're ready for 5A, is it?
5A, okay.
Okay.
That is the ITAC initial plans recommendations for fiscal audit. Davis.
Okay, so, we are nearing the end of the fiscal year 17 fiscal compliance audit process. And so we are here today to present to you the draft reports. We have with us Mark Davis from the independent audit firm of Davis Barr. And he will take you through a summary of the results of the audit, including findings and recommendations. And once in the middle of his presentation, we're going to switch back over to me, and I'm going to address some additional information that's in your report, and then we'll go back to Mark. At the end of his report, then it'll come back to me. I'll give you an update on what's next, and we do have an action for this. So with that, I will hand it over to Mark.
Good morning. Scope of this year's audits, we began the process way back in July when we met with the Audit Subcommittee and agreed upon the various procedures we were going to be performing for this year's examinations. At that time, there were just a couple minor changes that were made in the procedures. There was clarification related to indirect costs. Before, old procedures just referred to a cognizant agency, and the committee had clarified that to identify that as being a federal or state agency, or that the cost allocation plan be audited by an independent CPA firm. The second clarification that was made to the procedures had to do with a definition of RTCIP expenditures, that those expenditures actually included expenditures but also commitments that the agency may have. We did perform the procedures on all 24 agencies, the 18 cities, county, MTS, NCTD, SANDAG, Caltrans, and the ITOC. We performed the procedure starting in about September of last year, and they went all the way through, last agency was conducted in December. There were 7 major areas that we look at in performing these procedures. The first was expenditures, and here we look at least 25% of the total expenditures that each agency incurs to determine whether or not those expenditures were included in the RTIP and that they also represent eligible Transnet costs. And we had no exceptions for any of the agencies that were reviewed. There were 3 agencies that are still in the process of obtaining approval from their various councils, city councils, regarding inter-project transfers at the time that we issued the draft reports to you. Those are the cities of Chula Vista, El Cajon, and San Diego. All of them have meetings scheduled between now and the time that we'll be issuing final reports to get those approvals obtained. The second area we took a look at was maintenance of effort requirements, and here we compare the discretionary expenditures that each agency reports on its street report to the MOE base year amount that we calculated a couple years ago to determine whether or not those local agencies are spending at least that MOE base amount. And again, we had no exceptions noted for any of the agencies for this year. Last year, we did report to you that the city of Lemon Grove did have an unmet MOE requirement, and they fell short by about $21,000. They came to you and requested a 3-year period to cure that deficit, and they've already cured it as part of this year's audit. The third area we take a look at is the 30% SANDAG board policy rule, whereby agencies' balance can be no more than 30% of their annual apportionments. And this year, for the first time that we've been doing these engagements, there were no exceptions noted. All the agencies had balances that were below that 30% threshold. Last year, you had 4 agencies that were above that. They've all cured their excess. This is the point that Lisa referred to, that we're going to refer over to her to talk about a separate matter related to this.
So at your last meeting, the ITOC received a letter from a constituent with several areas of concern, and I was asked to address the what Mark was just speaking to, what we call the 30% rule. And so I would like to do that right now. So the concern was that the city of San Diego is not in compliance with this rule. And so the rule is based on results of the fiscal and compliance audits. So a jurisdiction can have no more than 30% of their annual apportionment on hand, which would mean at year end, because it's a result of the fiscal and compliance audit. So I provided some additional information on pages 2 and 3 of your agenda report. And as Mark just mentioned, the draft audit results show that the city is compliant with this rule. They were allowed $9.5 million on hand, which is 30% of their annual apportionment. And if you look at page 2, you can see this calculation here is straight from their audit, the draft audit report. So for their local street and road balance, that's the old Transnet funding, they have a little over $1 million. Then for the local street improvement, the extension funding, there's negative on the congestion relief and maintenance, has a small balance, which gives them a total of negative $166,000, which puts them well below the allowed $9.5 million. And then based on Ms. Rhodes' concerns, we decided to look back at each year of the extension ordinance, which is then on the next page, if you look at page 3. And you'll see that other than in fiscal year 2009, the city was in compliance with this rule. And so for the fiscal year 2009, once we received the results, SANDAG did defer payment of the annual apportionments to the city, which is required under this rule. And then on May 10th, 2011, the city submitted a certification of compliance using the fiscal year 11 annual apportionment. That's the 30% at that time. And we began payments to the city. Their first request was for July 2011. So there were no payments to the city between May 2009 and June of 2011. So I hope that addresses this concern. I don't know if there's any questions.
Will you be responding to that constituent that raised the issue?
This was the response. That we
can write her a letter.
Well, that was just my question.
Yeah, I'm not sure if...
Write her a letter or send her an email, however she delivered it. It makes sense to me.
Yeah, we'll do that.
Good.
Okay, and then we'll move back to Mark.
Okay, so the fourth area that we took a look at for this year has to do with local street improvements and looking at the revenues that are spent on congestion relief versus maintenance. We made sure that at least 70% of the revenues for local street and road purposes were spent on congestion relief and no more than 30% was used for maintenance, and we had no exceptions for any of the agencies. We also took a look at the cumulative local street and road revenue to make sure that, again, on a cumulative basis, that no more than 30% of that revenue was used for maintenance. And again, no exceptions were noted related to that procedure. I do want to point out that there are 3 agencies that are getting very, very close to that 30% threshold. City of Oceanside is at 28.5%. City of San Diego is 29.2%, and the City of Poway is at 29.9%. The fifth area we reviewed has to do with the RTCIP program. Here we are ensuring that the agencies collect their approved exaction fees, that they're tracking those fees by development, and they're spending those fees on approved RTCIP projects. We did have 3 exceptions this year where agencies were not collecting the correct exaction fee. Those were the cities of Encinitas, Escondido, and National City. Of those, 2 of those cities, Encinitas and Escondido, have already recovered the under-collected exaction fee, and the City of National City at the time we issued the draft report was in the process of collecting that under-collected amount. Other procedures related to the RTCIP that we looked at have to do with those agencies that spend revenue on fund administration, and only the City of San Diego does that. The requirement is they have to spend less than 3% on fund administration. They spent 0.91%. No cities transferred, loaned, or exchanged their RTCIP funds, and no cities granted developer credits in lieu of collecting the exaction fees this past year. All agencies did provide documentation to us for review by the required date of December 1st. The 6th area we looked at was transit operator eligibility. And here we review whether or not that, compared to the prior year, that the operating costs for bus and rail services were less than the CPI increase for the prior year. This past year, CPI increased 4.06%, and we did have one instance of non-compliance where MTS was not in compliance with just the rail operator eligibility. Their operating costs increased 9.68%, over the prior year. And this item is going to be discussed in the very next agenda item. The final area that we looked at is related to indirect costs that are allocated to the projects. And this year we had 13 agencies that allocated indirect costs. That's up one from the prior year. The City of Lemon Grove is new this year in allocating indirect costs. 4 of those 13 agencies did have their indirect cost plans reviewed by a federal, state agency or an independent CPA firm. And of those remaining agencies, with the exception of Carlsbad and Chula Vista, all have had their methodology reviewed, or they've reviewed it in-house within the last 2 years. Carlsbad, at the time we did our review, they had last reviewed their indirect costs in 2013. They had a new plan that was prepared, but it doesn't go into effect until next fiscal year. The City of Chula Vista, same as in previous years, the last time that they had reviewed their indirect costs was in 2012. Subsequent to the issuance of the draft report, we were informed that they also, just like Carlsbad, have updated their methodology, had a new indirect cost plan prepared based on 2017 expenditures that will go into effect in 2018. The results of all these procedures are included in the various draft reports, and detail of the findings and management responses are all on the SANDAG website and available for review. We'll be finalizing the reports within 60 days after the ITALC reviews the draft reports, which is scheduled for this Friday. That concludes my report. I'm happy to answer any questions you may have on the AUPs for this year.
After transportation, not ITALC.
Yeah, transportation.
Transportation, yeah.
Was there any outstanding, the indirect cost allocation, does your report include the percentages that you discovered for those that did keep this record or had it approved?
Yes, this year there's a new schedule in the ITALC summary report that identifies all the agencies that do charge, or all the agencies and those that do charge indirect costs, what those indirect cost dollar amounts were that were charged, and what the percent is of the total Transnet expenditures. So it's there for you for this year.
We can see that.
Yes.
Yes. That's attachment E to the report. Attachment 1 is the huge attachment, and the first section of that is the Auditor Summary, and there's a couple of attachments to that, so that would be attachment E. We'll have that information.
We have reference copies here. If I can get anything one.
Okay, and then we have a couple of additional steps to close out this process. So the first is the next agenda item, which we will ask for your recommended approval, and then it goes to Transportation Committee this Friday, and ultimately to the board, considering approval on March 23rd. Then ITALC Chair, Dustin Fuller, is scheduled to present results of the draft audit to the Transportation Committee this Friday. And there's that 60-day waiting period between this Friday and issuance of the audits. So the auditors have time to finalize any changes to the report. And the ITALC is scheduled to consider the final drafts for acceptance at your June meeting. And then the results of this audit are then incorporated into the annual report, which was just discussed. So we do have an action item for this. The ITALC is asked to accept the draft independent auditor's report on results of the agreed upon procedures, your attachment 1, including initial findings and recommendations for presentation to the Transportation Committee on March 16, 2018. And that concludes my report.
Is there a motion?
I'd move to approve.
I second it.
Do we have any discussion or questions?
So if I could just, discussion of item 5B is separate from.
Yes, we'll do that next.
Okay, shall we vote? All in favor? Unanimous, thank you. just pass out this. This is the MTS funding eligibility request, and we'll stay here.
Yes. So, as was just mentioned, this is the second part of the steps to get through the audit procedure. And on an annual basis, the transit operators must hold costs for both bus and rail services to CPI, which is used as a measure to help keep costs reasonable year over year. As also mentioned, for fiscal year 17, the San Diego County Transportation specific CPI increased 4.06% over the prior year. So when you look at operations as a whole, MTS remains in compliance with the CPI limit. And then when parsing out the two components, bus and rail, bus services is also compliant, but rail is not. Now, the ordinance takes into consideration circumstances that may not allow compliance and provides a few options to the transit operators. The first is that they may request exclusions of certain unforeseen costs. The second, that they may use an average over a 3-year period for this calculation. Or third, they may use a combination of those two methods. So MTS is asking to exclude costs related to certain state of good repair, legislative, and one-time labor costs. And they've provided a letter, which is attachment 1 to this agenda report. So another factor to consider is that CPI is not determined until after year end. I believe it's in July that we actually get the number. Therefore, there's no target for the transit operators to budget against or to measure even throughout the year. Just food for thought there. So approval of the request by the board would allow MTS to receive their entire fiscal year 18 apportionment plus any additional revenues received in excess of the apportionment. So if actuals for the year come in higher than the projected amounts. And today we have two individuals from MTS. We have Larry Marinisi, the CFO, and we have Wayne Cherry, who is handing out items to you, and he's the COO Rail Operations. And we do have a recommendation on this. The Independent Taxpayer Oversight Committee is asked to consider the request of MTS for recommendation to the Transportation Committee that the Board of Directors, acting as the San Diego County Regional Transportation Commission, approve the Transnet Extension Ordinance funding eligibility request detailed in attachment 1 as permitted under the ordinance. And this concludes my report.
Well, I read this and it was interesting, and it appears to me that a couple of these major expenses are one time. But the minimum wage increase is not. That'll be continuing. I guess my question is, does the minimum wage increase affect the CPI? Will it in future years?
Sure.
Larry.
Morning, committee members. So CPI is independent from the minimum wage. You know that there was...
It is, but prices do go up.
Prices do go up. Will it have an effect on CPI in the future? It may, but I don't think to the degree in which it will impact us. Minimum wage is expected to go to $15 an hour just in a number of years. So yes. From $10.50 an hour to $15 an hour is a 50% increase for certain employees of the
But again, I would think there would be an increase in the CPI.
There will be, but from an incremental perspective, it won't have the same type of impact as it will to our operation. So it had an effect this year. Will it have effect on future fiscal years? Yes, it will. To what degree? I think we had it was a $600,000 impact in the last fiscal year. It's going to have an impact as well. I think the next increase is going to be in January 1st of 2019, which should impact our fiscal year 19 numbers.
I'm not belaboring this point, but how is that going to affect your goal of maintaining costs below the CPI?
It's going to be challenging.
The future impact.
It will be challenging, and those are just things outside of our control. So it will be challenging for us.
guess one thing going back to one of our earlier items where we talked about potential changes to the transnet ordinance, I think this is one area that is something I think that's on our plate for discussion. So the ordinance has these two distinct things, one for bus operations, one for rail operations. If you actually look at combined MTS operations, they were under the CPI. So that's an opportunity I think the board can talk about and say, you know, maybe there's some sort of, you just combine the numbers. The other thing is whether or not, you know, as operators, they negotiate long-term labor contracts and supplier contracts. So even when CPI is negative, so this year it's actually, you know, fairly positive. But we've had instances when CPI is negative, but usually you're not cutting labor costs, you know, in the middle of a contract and stuff. So the other discussion that's been on the table that I think we need to have and address is whether or not we put some sort of floor, some recognition that in times when CPI is negative, there's at least some amount that's acceptable. I mean, obviously the ordinance does provide these exceptions, recognizing that things, you know, change and there's unique circumstances each year, but just wanted to, you know, point out that, yeah, this is another area that's kind of on the plate, kind of like the local street level stuff and everything, that we need to, be a good idea to address.
This has occurred a number of years.
It's occurred because we had like negative CPI years. Yeah, it's occurred fairly regularly.
It's happened, I would say, a couple, 2 or 3 of the last few years.
Yeah.
Where it was either relatively close to zero or actually negative, where we had to achieve a 0% target.
Which is not.
The last 2 years were negative, and the year prior, 14, was 0.5%, then it was negative 2 years in a row prior to that. So yeah, it's been.
It doesn't recognize the nature of trans operations, right?
I have a different question. I'm just curious with regard to the SGR expenses. Why wouldn't the replacement of the couplers be a capital expense as opposed to operating expense?
But I was thinking.
I mean, I don't know about the motor overhaul, but it would just somehow strike me that the coupler replacement would have been a capital expense.
Yeah, from an accounting perspective, the threshold, they're not, there were a lot of them, but the threshold from a capital expenditure perspective didn't meet that threshold to move into our capital improvement program or a capitalized item.
Got it.
So
Is that threshold discretionary or is that?
I'm sorry?
Is that threshold set discretionary or is that?
It's a.
Who sets the threshold?
It is an agency threshold, and I don't remember off the top of my head what that number is, but it is something that we look at from an agency perspective.
It struck me that the other major cost was the platform reconstruction to fit the new cars, and that also would seem like the capital improvement.
Those were, go ahead.
Yeah, that was a program that we embarked on in 2009, 2010. It was nearly a $700 million capital program that rebuilt the entire blue line from the bottom up. It replaced all the station platforms system-wide except the new low-floor cars. We purchased 65 new Siemens low-floor cars during that time. And one of the issues, and it goes back to the couplers, the couplers and the traction motors is part of this one-time cost here is because the older Siemens SD100, our second generation vehicle, we still have to operate. Where we could, based on FTA guidelines, we can replace those cars in 2020. We'll likely have them with us until 2025, 2026 until we can have them replaced. We have $61 million saved up right now, counting next fiscal year's capital program, but it's a $240 million cost to replace those vehicles. Those vehicles have to communicate. They operate in train line together. If you've noticed, one of our trains are a 3-car train. The center car is the older high-floor car, but they have to communicate. And the coupler replacement, you can see, I give you a photo here, you can see the pins. Those electrical pins are how we communicate. And those couplers are 23 years old on the older cars. And as those get worn and loose, then we have train faults, and it causes a lot of delays. And so that, based on us having to keep those cars in service for an extended period, replaced, that had to happen. That, as well as rebuilding of the traction motors. Each coupler is about $38,000 and change, and the traction motors is about $15,000 and change, and those are one-time costs. Additionally, when we put the system into 100% state of good repair in 2015 with the rebuild of the blue line that was built on questionable infrastructure at the time back in the 70s. The existing, or the lines that came after that, The orange line is 30 years old in 2019, will be 30 years old. And so that's the time when we start doing some improvements on the infrastructure. So right now you can see that part of the cost there is our tire renewal program on the orange line. So the rail, the infrastructure that it was put on was much greater, and that's indicated in the letter. So it's minor improvements that need to be made. That's part of it, and that's an ongoing capital program. So.
And I note that if you had excluded these costs, you say that you'd be at 4.0%, which is just below. I see no reason not to recommend approval. I'll move that we recommend approval of this request.
Second that motion. I will second the motion. Any other discussion? All those in favor?
Thank you.
Thanks for coming. Thanks for waiting.
Appreciate it. For your efforts, your good explanation.
Item 7, let Stuart introduce this one. This is their compliance audit evaluation subcommittee recommendation.
Okay, I wasn't aware I was going to be.
Well, you don't have to.
Introducing this, but take it away.
I'll let Lisa take it away.
Okay. So the 5-year contract for auditing services is set to expire on June 30th, 2018. So in your September meeting, there was an evaluation subcommittee chosen. Was Stuart, Kai, Dick, and Tracy. They reviewed the scope of the RFP, submitted comments and suggestions. The RFP was then issued on December 29th. The subcommittee received 5 proposals, which they reviewed and evaluated. There were 2 chosen to participate in oral interviews on February 14th. And we have so we'll show you the results here.
While they're pulling that up, I would just say for the other members of our committee that the results were pretty clear to the group, and there was not a lot of controversy, and there's a very strong consensus on the choice. So, which you can probably see from the scores. I can't.
Can we make
Or
it
you
bigger?
can. Or maybe you can't see from the scores.
It's at 60.
Make it
80.
There was a lot of discussion as to who would be in the
Is there a way to
third
enlarge it?
place, but first place was very clear.
Oh, okay.
It's not
I thought, if you go back to the previous screen,
I think you can enlarge just down.
up at the top, just go the little
Yeah,
plus sign
the plus.
in the middle at the top, that way.
There.
Yeah.
There we go.
One more. There you go.
Yeah, a little bit more.
One or two more.
2 more clicks. Oh, no.
Now you can just center it.
Yeah, just center
Oh,
it.
yeah, just center it, that might work.
Maybe 100. There you go.
Can you see that?
There.
There we go, okay. So the top section, there's scoring sheets that each evaluator completes, and so these are the numerical scores, I guess. And that then ranks them as either 1 or 2 based on their individual scoring. And then you can see there's a combined rank score which just adds it up to provide us the overall rank. And as you can see, Davis Bar was chosen by every evaluator. One thing that we do want to point out with Davis Bar is that it is a different partner that was proposed for the engagement. It was not Mark. It's Jennifer Farr, the other of Davis Farr. And we currently work with her on the Sandak audits. She will not be part of that engagement. This will be her engagement.
Yeah, and for clarity for you folks, that the notion of switching partners is to get what people refer to as sort of fresh eyes and fresh perspective, because Davis Farr has been the auditor on the job for 5 or something years.
8 years, 8
okay.
years, yeah.
Including a predecessor firm, but it was the same.
Mark, it was Mark, yeah. Yeah.
But Tracy's also had experience working with the partner who would take over the account, and she has tremendous confidence in the ability to bring a very different perspective, which is one of the key things you might want to do after 8 years.
I'd have to take if you were here, but 20? Is that?
Yes. He was not impressed with the interview. Yeah, there were, yeah. You know, what's interesting is when you, as an evaluator, you know, there's the 2 phases. You have the proposal, which then can get them into the interview, and then you have the interview. And you don't know which way it goes. Sometimes you have a fabulous proposal, and the interviews don't provide you with what you really need. And sometimes it's the opposite. Yeah.
Hey, when we were picking our triennial audit, we had a similar expectation of a fresh set of eyes, and I think we came to realize that it's kind of specialized, and once these people get in and start understanding the process, it's hard for others to come in and sort of
kind of step in, yeah. There's a lot to understand between the ordinance and the board policy.
I think we felt like, at least from my perspective, and I think the others agreed, that we felt like we kind of got a combination of a partner with, you know, it appeared to us that a partner that has a different style and approach, but with the firm that has a lot of experience and background, and you combine those things, you get the fresh perspective and you get the relevant experience and resource to, you know, if you run into something, she can go and ask the partner, and so there's, you know, they handled it really well in that way, from my perspective, in terms of their approach, and then the other firm, you know, was, I think, a little bit more, you know, their broader staffing with less relevant.
Did you discuss fees?
We reviewed these.
Were they comparable?
Yeah.
Actually, we got a better try.
I'm not remembering exactly, but I think, I'm sorry.
We have Jenny here from contracts to make sure we.
But that was
stay
absolutely
within
part of the discussion.
limits of what we can and can't.
And an interesting part of that was that the Davis firm was actually very competitive on fee, and that was not because there was any explicit discounting based on them already doing the, you know, having the knowledge to work with us.
Would you like the motion to approve?
I would love one.
I so move.
I'll second that. Thank you. All those in favor? Ayes have it. All right. I believe that concludes our agenda. Next meeting is scheduled for April 11th.
Could I ask one question?
Sure.
What is this March 21st and March 28th meetings?
No, we took care of it because Kai was able to come in a little later today, so we're good. We held the
Good
meeting
man,
today.
Kai. We owe you one.
Good.
That was probably the soft so we didn't
Yeah,
want to
thank
do.
you very much.
To be honest, because if we had to fit in another meeting,
And we are adjourned then.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, everybody.